I'll never forget the sound of the rocks sealing me in darkness. A mountain breathing, then an exhale of dust, and suddenly nothing but my own heartbeat echoing off stone walls. It was supposed to be a simple hiking adventure, something Jack had planned for weeks, right down to the mining tour that wasn't on any official map. When the beam from his flashlight disappeared up the tunnel and the rumbling started, I knew with terrible clarity this wasn't an accident. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They say true character reveals itself in moments of crisis. For me, that moment came 300 feet underground in an abandoned silver mine in Colorado's Elk Mountains. I should have seen the signs, should have noticed how Jack's smile never quite reached his eyes when he insisted we explore just one more tunnel. But hindsight doesn't help when you're trapped in the dark with only a dying phone light and the crushing realization that the person who was supposed to love you just tried to bury you alive. My name is Megan Harper. 3 months ago, I was finishing my geology degree and sharing an apartment with a man I thought was building a future with me. Now I'm sitting in a cabin that smells of pine and wood smoke, looking out at mountains that no longer terrify me, writing this not as a confession, but as a warning. Because surviving isn't just about escaping the darkness. Sometimes it's about facing what emerges with you. The sound started small, just pebbles skittering across stone. Then larger rocks followed, and within seconds a wall of debris sealed the narrow passage where Jack had just disappeared. I screamed his name, not understanding yet, thinking he might be trapped on the other side. The dust made me cough, filling my lungs as I stumbled toward where the exit had been moments before. My headlamp illuminated a solid wall of rock and dirt where the path had been. "Jack?" I called again, my voice bouncing back at me. "Jack, can you hear me?" Nothing but the settling of rocks and my own ragged breathing answered. I fumbled for my phone. 1 bar of service. Somehow, a miracle of mountain physics. I dialed Jack's number, thinking maybe he was searching for help, maybe he'd been ahead when the collapse happened. 3 rings, then his voice, calm and detached. "You weren't supposed to have service down there." My blood froze. "What did you say?" I said, "You weren't supposed to have service." His voice was flat, emotionless in a way I'd never heard before. "The collapse was calculated, Megan. No one knows we're at this mine. No one will look for you here." "Jack, what are you talking about? This isn't funny. I'm trapped." My voice rose with panic, my free hand pressing against the wall of fallen rock. "I know. That's the point." A pause then with chilling simplicity. "You know too much, Megan. About the money. About Everglade Holdings. I can't risk you talking." The Everglade files. The accounting discrepancies I'd spotted while helping him organize his work documents last week. The questions I'd innocently asked about the offshore accounts. I'd thought he was embarrassed when he quickly changed the subject. Now I understood he was calculating. "Jack, please. I don't care about any of that. I won't say anything. Just get help. Goodbye, Megan. If it helps, I did love you. Just not enough." The call ended. I stood motionless, my phone's light casting long shadows across the rocky floor. Jack had just tried to kill me. Jack had orchestrated this whole trip to leave me to die in an abandoned mine. The realization was too enormous to process, so my mind broke it into smaller, manageable pieces. I was trapped. I had limited battery. No one knew where I was, and the man I'd shared my bed with for 2 years had sealed me underground. Panic rose like floodwater, threatening to drown rational thought. I forced myself to breathe slowly, counting each inhale. One problem at a time. First, assess the situation. The tunnel I was in stretched back into darkness. My headlamp was still working, and I had my phone with minimal battery and that miraculous single bar of service. I had a small day pack with a water bottle, energy bar, and basic first aid kit. I was wearing hiking boots, jeans, and layers appropriate for the cool mountain air. I turned away from the rock fall and pointed my light down the tunnel. If this had been an active mine, there might be another way out. Mines had ventilation shafts, multiple tunnels, emergency exits. This knowledge, gleaned from my geology courses, became a lifeline to cling to. Think, Megan, I whispered to myself. Use what you know. I called 911, but the call dropped before it connected. Signal lost. I switched my phone to airplane mode to conserve battery, allowing myself only to use its flashlight when necessary. The headlamp would be my primary light source until it failed. As I moved deeper into the tunnel, I traced my hand along the rough-hewn wall, feeling the cold stone beneath my fingertips. The passage narrowed in places, widened in others, occasionally branching off into smaller tunnels. I marked my path with small cairns of stones, arranging them to point the way I'd come in case I needed to retrace my steps. Looking back, I can still feel the weight of that darkness, the way it pressed against my skin like something alive. But what I remember most vividly is how clearly I could suddenly see Jack. Not the man I thought I knew, but the man he truly was. Jack Thornton walked into my life during my junior year of college. Tall, with an easy smile and the kind of confidence that filled a room, he was 5 years older and worked in finance for a resource development company. We met at a campus career fair where he was recruiting. He asked for my number instead of my resume. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I was flattered by his attention. I'd always been the serious one, more comfortable with rocks and geological surveys than parties and dating. My roommate called me professionally invisible, capable but forgettable. Jack made me feel seen. He listened when I talked about mineral formations and plate tectonics. He remembered details about my family, my childhood in Arizona, my dream of working in environmental geology. When he asked me to move in after 8 months, it seemed fast but right. My mother warned me to maintain my independence, but I was already planning our future together. Jack handled the finances, found us an apartment I couldn't have afforded on my student budget, and introduced me to his colleagues like I was already his wife. The first year was everything I'd hoped for. The second year, things began to shift, so gradually I barely noticed. Jack started checking my phone, saying he was just looking for a photo. He questioned my male classmates, suggesting they had ulterior motives. He criticized my clothes, my friends, the time I spent studying. "You don't need to work so hard," he'd say. "I make enough for both of us. You could focus on building our home life." When I insisted on finishing my degree, he acted supportive, but I'd catch these moments. A flash of anger quickly masked, a tightening around his eyes. He started planning our weekends, filling my free time with activities he chose. If I wanted to study instead, he'd call me selfish. Somehow, I always ended up apologizing. The isolation happened so gradually I didn't see it happening. My college friends stopped calling after Jack repeatedly answered my phone and told them I was too busy to talk. My family visits became less frequent because Jack always had a reason we couldn't go. Work commitments, plans with his friends, financial constraints. "Your family doesn't respect boundaries," he told me once after my mother called too late in the evening. "We need to establish our own life." I began walking on eggshells, calibrating my behavior to avoid his displeasure. If dinner wasn't ready when he got home, he wouldn't yell, but he'd grow coldly distant, sometimes for days. If I spoke too enthusiastically about my studies or a potential job prospect, he'd subtly undermine my confidence. "The environmental sector is so unstable right now," he'd say. "You're smart, but you lack real-world experience. I'm just trying to protect you from disappointment." His protection felt increasingly like a cage, but I couldn't see another option. My name wasn't on the lease. My student bank account was linked to his, for convenience. He'd even convinced me to let him manage my student loan payments, saying his financial expertise would help us optimize our money. The control extended to my appearance. My wardrobe slowly transformed as Jack bought me clothes he preferred, always a little too tight, a little too revealing. When I wore my comfortable field clothes, he'd make comments about letting myself go. I started to see myself through his eyes, always lacking, always needing improvement. Looking back, I realized he was methodically dismantling my independence. Each sacrifice seemed small in isolation. A friend I stopped contacting, a hobby I abandoned because it took time away from him, an opinion I learned to keep to myself. But together, they formed the bars of an invisible prison. The worst part was that I still believed he loved me. I interpreted his control as care, his jealousy as passion. When rare moments of the old Jack surfaced, bringing me coffee while I studied, listening to my excited babble about geological formations, holding me through the night, I clung to them as proof that our relationship was worth saving. Then came the Everglade files. I was helping Jack organize his home office when I noticed financial statements that didn't add up. Millions moving between accounts, with names like Karst Holdings and Seismic Ventures. Environmental impact waivers with signatures that looked suspiciously similar. I asked innocent questions, genuinely curious about his work. His reaction was subtle but chilling. A momentary stillness, like a predator assessing threat. Then a casual dismissal, so smooth I almost missed the edge in his voice. Just routine transfers, sweetheart. Nothing interesting. Hey, didn't you say you wanted to try that new restaurant tonight? Subject changed, documents whisked away. But I'd seen enough to know something wasn't right. And Jack had seen that I'd seen. The hiking trip was his idea, proposed just 2 days later. You've been working so hard on your thesis. Let's get away this weekend, just the two of us. There's an amazing spot in the Elk Mountains I've been wanting to show you. Some old mining tunnels you'd love, Ms. Geology. It was the first spontaneous, thoughtful suggestion he'd made in months. I was touched, thinking perhaps he was trying to reconnect. I said yes immediately, hungry for any glimpse of the man I'd fallen in love with. The drive up was beautiful. Winding mountain roads with aspen trees just starting to turn golden. Jack was attentive, charming, asking about my thesis research, playing my favorite music. When we reached the trailhead, he insisted on carrying the heavier backpack, making sure I had enough water. Every red flag that had risen in my mind over the past week was lowered by his apparent return to the Jack I thought I knew. The hike to the abandoned mine took 3 hours. Jack had discovered it during a work survey, he claimed. Not on tourist maps, just an old silver operation abandoned in the 1940s. I was excited. This was exactly the kind of geological exploration I loved. The entrance was partially concealed by vegetation, but once inside, the tunnels were surprisingly stable, reinforced with old timber supports. The main shaft goes back about half a mile, Jack said, his headlamp illuminating the way. The interesting stuff is down this side tunnel. There's an amazing quartz seam you have to see. I followed him deeper into the mountain, marveling at the exposed rock faces, the glint of minerals in our headlamps. Jack kept looking back at me, checking something in his expression I couldn't read. When we reached a narrow passage, he gestured for me to wait. Let me check if it's stable enough for both of us, he said. Stay here a minute. He disappeared around the bend. Moments later came the rumble, the crash, the sudden wall of debris. And then the phone call that revealed everything. Now, trapped in the dark with the truth, I forced myself to think like the geologist I was training to become. Not the terrified woman I felt like. Mines follow ore veins. Veins create natural weaknesses in rock formations. Where there's one tunnel, there are often others. I began methodically exploring, conserving my light, marking my path. Hours passed. My headlamp began to dim. The silence was absolute except for the occasional drip of water and my own breathing. When I found the vertical shaft, I almost missed it. Just a darker shadow in the darkness. A slight movement of air. I tossed a small stone into it, counting seconds until I heard a distant clatter. Deep, but not impossibly so. And where there was a shaft, there might be a way out. The climb was terrifying. Narrow handholds carved into the rock wall, rotting wooden supports that crumbled at my touch. I ascended slowly, testing each hold before trusting my weight to it. My muscles burned, my fingers bleeding from sharp rock edges. Twice I slipped, catching myself at the last moment, heart pounding so loudly I thought it might shake loose more rocks. When I felt fresh air on my face, I thought I was imagining it, but the quality of darkness had changed. Less absolute, more gray than black. I climbed faster, desperation giving me strength. Finally, my hand reached up and found not rock, but rooted soil and vegetation. I pulled myself up into a narrow opening, barely large enough for my shoulders, hidden by bushes and partially collapsed. I emerged into late afternoon sunlight so bright it hurt my eyes. I lay on the ground, feeling the warmth of the sun on my skin, gulping clean air. I was on the mountainside, perhaps a quarter-mile from where we'd entered the main tunnel. No sign of Jack or his vehicle. My phone had just enough battery to make one call. Not to Jack, not even to 911. I called Diane Wilcox, my thesis advisor, and the only person who knew I respected enough to trust with my life. "Megan? What's wrong? You sound terrible." "I need help," I managed, my voice raw from dust and fear. "I'm on Silver Cliff Mountain. Jack left me to die in a mine. Please come. Please bring help." Then the phone died, and all I could do was wait and hope she understood enough to act. The next hours are a blur in my memory. Finding a clearing visible from the air. Using rocks to spell help, large enough to be seen. Rationing my remaining water. Fighting the urge to sleep that might have been the beginning of hypothermia as the mountain air cooled with evening. The search helicopter found me just before dusk, its spotlight cutting through the gathering darkness like a promise. The rescue team that rappelled down seemed surprised to find me conscious and relatively unharmed. They had expected a caving accident, not an attempted murder. "Your professor called it in," one of the paramedics told me as they checked me for injuries. Said her student was trapped on Silver Cliff by her boyfriend. "We thought it might be a domestic situation gone bad." "It was," I said, the reality of Jack's betrayal still impossible to fully comprehend. "He collapsed the tunnel entrance. He left me to die." The paramedic exchanged glances with his colleague. "The police will want to talk to you." At the hospital, between examinations for dehydration and minor injuries, I gave my statement to a detective named Reyes. I told her everything. The Everglade files, Jack's controlling behavior, the phone call where he admitted what he'd done. She listened without interruption, making notes, her expression growing grimmer with each detail. "We'll find him," she promised. "Financial crimes leave paper trails. Attempted murder leaves witnesses. He won't get away with this." But that night, alone in my hospital room, I wasn't thinking about justice. I was processing the revelation that the relationship I'd invested 2 years in had been a slow-motion trap, culminating in an actual physical one. I'd been blind to the danger because I'd wanted so badly to be loved. Each compromise, each accommodation, each surrender of my autonomy had led me deeper into a tunnel with no exit. Except I had found an exit. I had saved myself. And that realization, more than anything, became the foundation of what would come next. The aftermath of survival isn't a clean narrative. No one tells you about the sleepless nights, the phantom sounds of falling rocks that jolt you awake, or how the simple act of entering a darkened room can trigger a panic attack. They don't mention how hospital walls start to feel like another kind of cave, or how police questions, though necessary, force you to relive your trauma in high definition. I spent 3 days in Mountain View Medical Center, treated for mild dehydration, superficial cuts, and the early stages of hypothermia. Physical recovery was straightforward. The psychological aftermath was more complex. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that darkness. Every time my phone rang, I expected to hear Jack's voice telling me I was never meant to escape. Detective Reyes visited daily, her calm presence anchoring me as I recounted details I hadn't initially remembered, the specific names on the Everglade documents, conversations where Jack had mentioned contingency plans that I'd assumed were about financial security, not criminal activity. With each statement, the picture became clearer. Jack Thornton wasn't just a controlling boyfriend. He was involved in a massive environmental fraud scheme. The mining survey had been his cover for finding a convenient place to dispose of someone who knew too much. "We haven't located him yet," Reyes told me on the 3rd day, her dark eyes watchful. "His credit cards haven't been used. His phone is off. But we will find him, Megan. People like Jack make mistakes. They always do." I nodded, but something inside me knew Jack wouldn't be caught easily. He'd been planning me for too long. When Diane Wilcox arrived at the hospital, I barely recognized my poised, academic advisor in this fierce woman who swept into my room like an avenging Valkyrie. Silver-streaked hair flying behind her. "You're coming home with me," she announced, brooking no argument. "My cabin has a guest room, mountain views, and most importantly, no memories of that bastard." I hadn't considered where I would go. I couldn't return to the apartment I'd shared with Jack, both for safety reasons and because I simply couldn't bear to see our life together, now revealed as an elaborate stage set rather than a home. My parents lived in Arizona, too far away for immediate support, and I wasn't ready to explain everything to them yet. I don't want to impose, I said weakly. Diane fixed me with the same look she gave students who submitted subpar work. Megan Harper, you just survived being buried alive by a sociopath. You're not imposing, you're recovering. The cabin is remote enough to be safe and close enough to town for your appointments. End of discussion. And so I found myself in Diane's rustic cabin overlooking the valley, 20 miles from our university campus and light years from the life I'd been living 2 weeks ago. The guest room had shelves lined with geology books, a window seat perfect for watching thunderstorms roll over the mountains, and most importantly, 2 doors, one to the hallway, one to a small deck. No chance of being trapped. Diane gave me space but remained a steady presence. She didn't hover or ask how I was feeling every hour. Instead, she simply included me in her daily routines. Morning coffee on the deck, afternoon work sessions at the large dining table, where she reviewed student papers, while I tried to focus on my neglected thesis research, evening walks along the pine-bordered trails near the cabin. 2 weeks into my stay, I received a call from Detective Reyes. "We found your apartment door wide open this morning," she said without preamble. Looks like Thornton came back for something. The place was searched thoroughly. My blood ran cold. Did he take anything? Hard to tell without you there. Any chance you could come take a look? We'll have officers with you the entire time. The thought of returning to that space made my stomach clench, but I needed to know what Jack had been looking for. I'll be there in an hour. Diane insisted on driving me. The 30-minute trip passed in silence, her hands tight on the steering wheel, my mind racing through possibilities. What had Jack returned for? What was so important he'd risk being caught? The apartment building looked exactly as I remembered. Modern, anonymous, the kind of place where neighbors nodded politely but never really knew each other. Perfect for a man who valued privacy and control. Yellow police tape crossed his door. Detective Reyes waited in the hallway, her expression carefully neutral. "You don't have to do this," she reminded me. "We can document everything, bring photos to you." "I need to see it," I said, steeling myself. I need to know what he was looking for. Stepping across that threshold was like walking into a stranger's home. Everything looked familiar yet fundamentally wrong, like a movie set based on my life but with crucial details altered. Cushions had been removed from the couch, drawers pulled out, books taken from shelves. The methodical destruction had a cold, calculating quality that was pure Jack. "The bedroom was hit hardest," Reyes said, guiding me down the hallway. Our bedroom, the space where I'd felt safest with Jack, had been transformed into ground zero of his search. The mattress was slashed, dresser drawers emptied, closet ransacked. My clothes lay in heaps on the floor, some torn as if in anger. But it was my desk that held the answer. The small writing desk, where I'd worked on school assignments and occasionally helped Jack organize his work files, stood with its drawers removed, the hidden compartment beneath the center drawer exposed and empty. "There," I said, pointing. "That's what he came for." Reyes moved closer. "What was in there?" "I don't know. I didn't even know that compartment existed." Another secret in a relationship built on them. As Reyes examined the desk, I noticed something on the floor half hidden under the bed. A small flash drive I didn't recognize. I pointed it out to one of the officers, who carefully bagged it as evidence. "Could be nothing," Reyes said. "Could be everything. We'll check it out." The rest of the apartment held nothing but painful reminders of my blindness. The kitchen where Jack had insisted I learn to cook his favorite meals, the living room where he'd criticized my choice of friends, the bathroom where he'd commented on my appearance, suggesting, quote, improvements with such seeming concern that I'd mistaken control for care. I gathered what I needed: clothes, academic materials, the few mementos that were truly mine, and left without looking back. Whatever life I'd tried to build in that space had been a fiction, The reality was what I'd seen in the mine. Jack would sacrifice me without hesitation to protect himself. The flash drive proved to be our first real break. It contained encrypted files that, once cracked by the FBI's cybercrime unit, revealed the full scope of Everglade Holdings' activities. Jack and his partners had been falsifying environmental impact studies for mining operations across 3 states, accepting bribes to push through permits for projects that would contaminate groundwater and destroy protected habitats. "Your thesis research," Diane said when I explained what the investigators had found. It was about groundwater contamination patterns in former mining sites. "That's why he got nervous when you saw those files." I nodded, the irony not lost on me. My expertise made me both useful to him and dangerous. "And now it makes you their star witness," she pointed out, "if they can find him." 2 months passed. I moved from Diane's cabin to a small apartment near campus, determined to reclaim my independence despite the nightmares that still plagued me. I finished my thesis, defended it successfully, and began applying for graduate programs far from Colorado. I spoke weekly with Detective Reyes, but there had been no confirmed sightings of Jack until the text message. It came on a Tuesday evening as I was reviewing acceptance letters from geology programs. An unknown number, but the content left no doubt who had sent it. "You were supposed to stay buried, Megan. Some problems require a second solution." My hands shook so badly I could barely dial Reyes's number. Within an hour, my apartment was filled with police officers, my phone taken as evidence, plans being made to move me to a safe location. The text had pinged off a tower in Boulder, less than an hour away. "He's back," Reyes said grimly, "and he's desperate." That night, as officers stood guard outside my temporary safe house, I lay awake remembering how it felt to be trapped in the darkness, believing I would die there. The fear was still present, a cold weight in my chest, but something else had grown alongside it. A determination that Jack would not define my story. The pattern became clear as I traced backward through our relationship. Jack had selected me carefully, a serious student without an extensive social network, someone whose disappearance would be noticed but not immediately investigated, someone whose trust could be cultivated and exploited, someone who might help him understand geological surveys and environmental reports without asking too many questions. I had been a tool, not a partner. My value to Jack had been what I could provide: validation, domestic support, occasional technical insights, and ultimately, a convenient person to eliminate when I became a liability. The realization was both devastating and strangely freeing. If our entire relationship had been transactional for him, then his opinion of me, his judgment, his criticism, his apparent love, had never been real, which meant I could stop measuring myself by his standards. For the first time since escaping the mine, I felt something shift inside me, not healing exactly, but realignment. I'd been defining myself as a victim, the woman who had been deceived, controlled, and nearly killed. But there was another narrative available. The geologist who had analyzed her surroundings, found an escape route, and saved herself. The witness whose testimony would help bring down a criminal operation. The survivor who was rebuilding her life on her own terms. The safe house was comfortable but sterile, a corporate apartment with beige walls and functional furniture. I was allowed outside only with an escort. My movements reported, my communications monitored for my protection. It was a different kind of cage, well-intentioned but confining. After 3 days, I requested a meeting with Reyes and the FBI agent assigned to the case, a serious woman named Blackwood, who specialized in environmental crimes. "I can't live like this," I told them. "I survived being buried alive. I won't survive being buried in protective custody." Reyes frowned. "Thornton has made explicit threats against you until we locate him." "You might never locate him," I interrupted. "He's smart, he has resources, and he's had months to establish a new identity. Meanwhile, I'm putting my life on hold, letting him control me from a distance. Again." Agent Blackwood studied me with analytical eyes. "What are you proposing, Ms. Harper?" "I want to continue my life, carefully, with precautions, but not in hiding. I've been accepted to the University of Washington's graduate program in environmental geology. It's across the country, in a city where I have no connections and Jack has no reason to look for me. I'll change my appearance, use my middle name, Stay in touch with your office. But I need to move forward. The discussion went back and forth for hours. Eventually, we reached a compromise. I would relocate to Seattle under a moderate security protocol. I would check in regularly with a local FBI contact. I would alter my appearance and use my middle name, Lynn, professionally. I would carry a panic button and live in a building with security features. It wasn't perfect freedom, but it was movement. And after months of reaction, of responding to Jack's actions and the investigation's requirements, I needed to reclaim my agency. The University of Washington campus sprawled along the shores of Lake Washington, nothing like the mountain setting of my undergraduate years. The geology department welcomed Lynn Harper as a promising graduate student specializing in environmental impact assessment. My new apartment was small but mine, with wide windows that let in abundant light, the opposite of the darkness I still sometimes felt closing in around me. I dyed my brown hair blonde, cut it short, started wearing contacts instead of my usual glasses. The woman who looked back at me from the mirror was a stranger at first. Someone with my features, but not my history. Gradually, I grew into this new version of myself, finding aspects of her I recognized and others that surprised me. The program was challenging in the best way, forcing my mind to focus on complex problems rather than hypervigilance. My background in groundwater contamination made me valuable to a research project examining long-term effects of abandoned mines on surrounding ecosystems, an irony not lost on me. I worked long hours, made casual acquaintances, and slowly built a life that felt almost normal. 6 months into my new existence, the call came from Agent Blackwood. "We found his car," she said, without preamble, abandoned at a trailhead in Olympic National Park. Rangers reported it had been there at least a week. My heart rate spiked. And Jack? No sign yet. Search teams are combing the area. The vehicle contained camping equipment, several false identification documents, and approximately $50,000 in cash. Olympic National Park was less than 3 hours from Seattle. The knowledge that Jack had been so close sent a chill through me, but I forced myself to think logically. He wouldn't abandon that much cash unless something went wrong, I said. Either he's running from someone else, or he had an accident in the wilderness, Blackwood finished. It's rough terrain out there, especially for someone who isn't an experienced outdoorsman. I remembered Jack's confident handling of our hiking gear, his knowledge of the mountain trails that had led to the mine. He knows enough to be dangerous, I said, to himself and others. We'll find him, Blackwood assured me, dead or alive. The search stretched into weeks. I insisted on maintaining my normal routine, refusing to hide again, though I accepted the plainclothes officer who now shadowed me to classes and research sites. If Jack was still out there, still hunting me, I wouldn't make it easy for him. But neither would I disappear. It was during this period of renewed tension that I met Dr. Eliza Shimikyu, a visiting professor specializing in the remediation of contaminated mining sites. She needed a research assistant familiar with groundwater testing protocols, and my advisor recommended me. Working with her gave me access to field sites I wouldn't otherwise have seen as a first-year graduate student, and coincidentally provided another layer of security, as we always worked with a full team in remote locations. Dr. Shimizu was brilliant, demanding, and unexpectedly kind. She pushed me to develop my own research questions alongside her established protocols, invited my analysis rather than just my assistance, and never made me feel like my contributions were merely convenient. After months of being valued for what I could provide to Jack, being valued for my mind was revolutionary. You have unusual insight for someone at your career stage, she told me, after I identified a pattern in soil samples that had eluded the rest of the team. Your traumatic experience gave you perspective most geologists gain only after decades in the field. I had shared a simplified version of my history with her, enough to explain the security precautions, but not the full emotional weight of the betrayal. Her matter-of-fact acceptance helped me see how my experience had shaped, but not defined me. Pressure transforms materials, I said, attempting humor. Basic geology. Indeed. And the most interesting formations often result from the most intense pressures. She studied me with perceptive eyes. The question is, what will you become, now that the pressure has been released? It was a question I returned to often in the months that followed, as the search for Jack continued without result. Some days I felt like I was simply going through the motions, constructing an elaborate facade of normalcy while waiting for the other shoe to drop. Other days I forgot to be afraid, absorbed in research, or laughing with classmates, or watching the sunset over Puget Sound. The transformation was gradual, almost imperceptible, like the slow weathering of stone. I began to sleep through the night more often than not. I stopped checking over my shoulder constantly. I started making plans that extended beyond the immediate future. A research project that would take years, a favorite coffee shop where the baristas knew my order, friendships that deepened beyond casual acquaintance. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday almost exactly 1 year after the mine, Agent Blackwood called again. "We found him," she said. Her usual professional tone softened slightly. Or rather, what's left of him. A backpacker had discovered human remains in a remote area of Olympic National Park, miles from any established trail. Dental records confirmed it was Jack Thornton. He had apparently fallen from a cliff edge, perhaps during a storm. The medical examiner estimated he had been dead for approximately 10 months, not long after abandoning his vehicle. "Are they sure?" I asked, my voice steady, despite the storm of emotions breaking inside me. "Absolutely certain?" "DNA confirmation came back this morning," Blackwood said. "It's him, Megan. It's over." But it wasn't over, not really. Jack's death didn't erase what he'd done or heal what he'd broken. It didn't answer why he'd chosen me, why he'd believed killing me was his only option, why he'd been in Olympic National Park when he died. It didn't provide the closure that movies and books had led me to expect. What it did provide was certainty. I would never have to look over my shoulder for Jack again. I would never have to testify against him in court, reliving those moments in the mine under cross-examination. I would never know if he felt remorse or satisfaction, or nothing at all about what he'd done to me. That night, I sat on my apartment balcony watching fairy lights move across the dark water of Puget Sound. I thought about the woman I had been before the mine, trusting, eager to please, measuring my worth through others' approval. I thought about the woman who had emerged from the darkness, hypervigilant, suspicious, determined to survive. And I thought about who I might become now, without the shadow of Jack Thornton looming over my future. For the first time since leaving Colorado, I allowed myself to cry, not from fear or pain, but from the sheer relief of possibility. Jack had tried to make me disappear into the earth, to become one more secret the mountains kept. Instead, I had emerged transformed, not by his cruelty, but by my own resilience. The tears eventually subsided, leaving me emptied and somehow lighter. I wasn't naive enough to believe one cathartic moment would heal all wounds. Recovery wasn't linear. It was geological. Layers of experience compressing over time, occasional earthquakes of memory disrupting the surface, gradual erosion revealing new patterns beneath. But standing there under the vast Seattle sky, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a very long time. The simple, profound joy of being alive in a world full of possibilities. Jack had tried to take everything from me, including my future. His failure was now my freedom. Freedom comes in unexpected moments. For me, it arrived on a Wednesday morning when Agent Blackwood called to tell me they were officially closing Jack's case. His remains had been positively identified. The investigation into Everglade Holdings continued, but the part that involved me, the attempted murder, the manhunt, the protective surveillance, was over. "You're free to go back to using your full name," Blackwood said. "Free to move if you want, though I'd recommend staying where you've established yourself. Free to live without looking over your shoulder." I thanked her for everything, hung up the phone, and sat motionless at my kitchen table. The apartment felt suddenly unfamiliar, as if I were seeing it through different eyes. The security system I'd installed, the emergency backpack always packed by the door, the habit of sleeping with my bedroom door wedged open, all precautions that had structured my existence for the past year, now rendered unnecessary. That afternoon, I walked across the University of Washington campus without my usual hypervigilance. I didn't scan faces in the crowd, didn't plot emergency exits, didn't keep my back to walls. Instead, I noticed things I'd been too tense to appreciate. The cherry trees beginning to bud, students sprawled on the lawns enjoying rare February sunshine, the distant snow-capped peak of Mount Rainier visible between buildings. Dr. Shimizu found me sitting by the fountain outside the Earth Sciences building, my face tilted up to catch the weak winter sun. "You look different today," she observed, settling beside me. "Something's changed." I told her about the case being closed, about Jack's confirmed death, about the official end to my year of hiding. She listened, without interrupting, her intelligent eyes taking in more than just my words. "So what now?" she asked when I'd finished. "Who is Megan Harper without the shadow of Jack Thornton?" It was the perfect question. Direct, challenging, exactly what I needed. Not pity, not platitudes, but a prompt to look forward rather than back. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "I've been in survival mode for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to simply live." She nodded, unsurprised. After significant trauma, many people experience this disorientation. The threat provided structure, purpose, clarity. Its absence can feel like a different kind of loss. "So how do I move forward?" "The same way you survived the mine," she said simply. "One step at a time, using the tools you have, building something new from what remains." That conversation became the first step in my true recovery, not just surviving Jack's betrayal, but reclaiming my life from its shadow. I began with small changes, symbolic breaks from my security-focused existence. I rearranged my apartment furniture, positioning my desk to face the window rather than the door. I donated the emergency backpack to a homeless shelter. I started wearing my hair in its natural brown again, letting the blonde grow out. More significantly, I began reconnecting with parts of myself that had been buried even before the mine. I called my parents in Arizona, sharing more details about what had happened and my new life in Seattle. Their reactions, horror, guilt for not seeing Jack's true nature, relief at my safety, were painful but necessary to hear. The conversation opened a channel that had been narrowing for years, not just because of Jack's isolation tactics, but because of my own reluctance to seem less than perfect in their eyes. "We always knew you were strong," my father said, his voice rough with emotion. "But we never imagined you'd have to be this strong." I enrolled in a rock climbing course, a deliberate choice to reclaim confined spaces and heights on my own terms. The first session left me sweating and shaking, flashbacks to the mine threatening to overwhelm me. But the instructor, a woman named Kai with patient eyes and steady hands, talked me through the panic. "Feel the difference," she said as I clung to the wall. "In the mine, you had no equipment, no training, no choice. Here, you have a harness, a belayer, and the option to come down anytime. You're in control." By the 5th session, I could reach the top of the indoor wall without panic. By the 10th, I was planning an outdoor climb. The physical challenge became a metaphor for my recovery, finding handholds where I could, resting when I needed to, sometimes backtracking to try a different route, but always moving upward. Spring melted into summer, and with the improving weather came more opportunities for fieldwork. Dr. Shimizu's research project had expanded to include several former mining sites across Washington state, requiring regular trips to remote locations. These expeditions became my sanctuary, days filled with purposeful work, evenings around campfires with colleagues who shared my passion for understanding how human activity impacts the earth. During one such trip to an abandoned copper mine near the Canadian border, I found myself exploring a secured tunnel with Ryan Chen, a hydrologist from the EPA who had joined our research team. The space was nothing like the silver mine where Jack had left me, well lit, structurally sound, thoroughly mapped, but still, I felt my heart rate accelerate as we moved deeper underground. Ryan noticed my tension. "We can turn back if you want," he offered without judgment. "The samples from this section aren't critical." I shook my head, focusing on my breathing. "I need to do this. Not just for the research, but for me." He nodded, understanding without requiring explanation. Tell me about your thesis work, he suggested, giving me something else to focus on as we continued forward. I began describing my research on bioremediation techniques for heavy metal contamination, the words coming more easily as my scientific mind engaged with the topic. By the time we reached our sampling site, my breathing had steadied, my focus sharpened on the work rather than the enclosed space. As we collected water samples from a small underground stream, Ryan said casually, "You know, most people would have changed careers after what happened to you. Found something that didn't involve going back underground." I considered it, I admitted, carefully labeling a sample vial. But that would mean letting Jack take one more thing from me: my passion for this work. I've let him take enough. The words emerged without planning, a truth I hadn't fully articulated even to myself. Jack had already stolen so much. My trust, my sense of security, nearly 2 years of my life. I wouldn't let him have my future too. That realization became a turning point. I began to see my continued pursuit of geology not as stubborn denial of trauma, but as an act of reclamation. Every time I entered a cave system for research, every rock sample I collected, every underground water source I analyzed was a declaration. This is still mine. This knowledge, this passion, this capability belongs to me, not to the man who tried to use it against me. In July, almost 18 months after the mine, I received an unexpected email from Detective Reyes. The FBI investigation into Everglade Holdings had resulted in multiple indictments, including 3 of Jack's former colleagues. The prosecutors wanted me to testify about the documents I had seen and Jack's subsequent actions. "You don't have to do this," Dr. Shimizu said when I told her about the request. "Your deposition could be sufficient. No one would blame you for not wanting to relive this in a courtroom." I considered her words carefully. The prospect of testifying, of facing questions about Jack, about my relationship with him, about the mine, made my stomach clench. But something else stirred alongside the fear. The possibility of closure, of putting my experience to use protecting others from similar environmental crimes. "I think I need to do this," I said finally, "not just for the case but for me. To stand up and speak the truth, to be heard and believed. To use what happened to me to stop these people from continuing their operation under a different name." The trial was scheduled for October in Denver. As the date approached, I worked with the prosecutors to prepare my testimony, revisiting memories I had tried to compartmentalize. The process was draining but clarifying, like lancing a wound to release infection. Each time I recounted the events leading to the mine, they lost a fraction of their power over me. Returning to Colorado was harder than I had anticipated. The familiar outline of the Front Range against the sky, the quality of light in the high-altitude air, even the smell of pine and dust, all triggered a visceral response, a tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with the elevation. I stayed with Diane, whose fierce protectiveness had not diminished with time or distance. Her cabin remained a sanctuary, the mountains visible from the deck now a reminder of my strength rather than my vulnerability. "You've changed," she observed the night before my testimony, as we sat watching the sunset paint the peaks gold and purple. "Not just the hair or the confidence. There's something settled in you." I considered her words. "I'm not afraid of the same things anymore," I said finally. "I'm not afraid of being alone, or being unseen, or being less than perfect. After you've faced your own mortality in the dark, everything else seems manageable." "And Jack? Are you afraid of his ghost?" I shook my head slowly. "Not afraid. I'll never forgive what he did, but I'm not defined by it anymore. It's part of my story, not the whole story." Diane reached over and squeezed my hand, her academic reserve softening. "I always knew you'd make an exceptional geologist. I didn't realize you'd become such a philosopher too." The federal courthouse in Denver was an imposing structure of glass and stone. I wore a simple navy suit, my hair pulled back, my expression composed as I moved through security checkpoints and up to the courtroom. 3 of Jack's former colleagues sat at the defense table, men I had met at company functions, who had smiled at me while knowing what their company was doing, who had perhaps known what Jack planned for me. My testimony lasted 4 hours. I spoke clearly about the documents I had seen, the conversations with Jack that had raised red flags, the hiking trip that was meant to be my last. I described the controlled collapse of the tunnel, the phone call where Jack admitted his intentions, my escape through the ventilation shaft. I identified each defendant and detailed my interactions with them at Everglade functions. The defense attorneys tried to undermine my credibility, suggesting I had misinterpreted what I'd seen, that Jack had acted alone, that my escape proved there had been no real attempt on my life. I remained steady, neither defensive nor emotional, simply presenting what I knew to be true. When it was over, when I stepped down from the witness stand, I felt lighter. Not healed exactly, but unburdened of something I had been carrying for too long. The truth had been spoken, recorded, entered into evidence. Whatever the outcome of the trial, I had done what I came to do. Outside the courthouse, standing in the clear autumn sunlight, I took a deep breath of Colorado air. For the first time since leaving, it felt simply like air, not like a trigger or a memory or a threat. Just air, moving in and out of lungs that continued to function, feeding a body that had survived, supporting a mind that was finally looking forward more than back. That evening, I received a call from an unknown number. Wariness made me hesitate before answering, old habits resurfacing despite my progress. Megan Harper? A woman's voice, unfamiliar but somehow recognizable. Yes, who's this? My name is Sarah Thornton, Jack's sister. The world tilted momentarily, past and present colliding. Jack had mentioned a sister occasionally, someone he wasn't close to, who lived somewhere on the East Coast. I had never met her, never even seen a photograph. How did you get my number? I asked, my voice remarkably steady. Detective Reyes gave it to me. I've been following the trial coverage. I wanted to talk to you, if that's okay. We met at a public cafe near my hotel, a place busy enough to feel safe but quiet enough for conversation. Sarah Thornton looked nothing like her brother, shorter, with auburn hair and a directness in her gaze that Jack had always lacked. She sat across from me, hands wrapped around a coffee cup, nervousness evident in her posture. Thank you for agreeing to see me, she began. I know you have every reason to want nothing to do with anyone connected to Jack. I nodded, waiting for her to continue. I wanted to tell you how sorry I am for what he did to you. Her voice was steady, but her eyes revealed deep pain. And to let you know that his capacity for cruelty wasn't a surprise to me. She told me about growing up with Jack, about watching him manipulate their parents, about the small animals that disappeared in their neighborhood, about her own experiences with his calculated malice when she tried to expose him. She spoke about the gradual estrangement from her brother and their parents, who never believed her warnings about Jack's true nature. When I read about what happened to you, I recognized the pattern immediately, she said. The careful selection of a victim, the methodical building of dependency, the decisive elimination when you became inconvenient. It's what I'd been afraid he would do to someone for years. Her words should have disturbed me, but instead they offered a strange comfort. Jack's betrayal hadn't been about my failings or unworthiness. It had been about who he was, a nature he had hidden from me, as he had from many others. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Sarah continued. Not for him, and not for me for not finding a way to warn you. I just wanted you to know that you're not alone in seeing who he really was. And that surviving him, it makes you extraordinary. We talked for nearly 2 hours, not just about Jack, but about the aftermath of his influence, about rebuilding a sense of trust, about moving forward without letting trauma define us. When we finally parted, we exchanged contact information, not as friends exactly, but as allies who understood something few others could. The trial concluded 3 days later with guilty verdicts for all defendants on charges of fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. The attempted murder charge related to Jack's actions had been severed from the environmental crimes case, but the prosecution made clear that the evidence I provided had been crucial to connecting the dots between Everglades' corporate malfeasance and the personal violence Jack had been willing to employ to protect it. As I prepared to return to Seattle, Detective Reyes invited me for a final coffee in the same shop where I'd met Sarah. You did good, Megan, she said, her professional demeanor softening slightly. Your testimony was compelling, credible, and crucial to the case. Thank you for seeing it through, I replied. For believing me from the beginning. She nodded, then reached into her bag and withdrew a small box. This came from the evidence lockup. Now that the case is closed, it can be returned to you. Inside was my old phone, the one I'd had in the mine, its screen cracked from when I'd dropped it during my desperate climb up the ventilation shaft. I turned it over in my hands, remembering the single bar of service that had allowed me to hear Jack's confession, the flashlight that had guided my escape, the last call to Diane that had saved my life. You might want to keep it, Reyes suggested, as a reminder that sometimes the tools of survival come from unexpected places. I slipped the phone into my pocket, strangely moved by her insight. I've learned that lesson well, I said. Nothing in my life has turned out as expected, but I'm starting to think that might be a good thing. She smiled, the expression transforming her serious face. The best stories never follow a predictable path. Neither do the best lives. Back in Seattle, I returned to my research with renewed focus. The trial had been exhausting but clarifying, forcing me to articulate not just what had happened, but how it had changed me. I was no longer simply surviving. I was building something new from the experience, a career focused on environmental justice, a life balanced between caution and openness, a self defined by resilience rather than trauma. In December, Dr. Shimizu called me into her office, her expression uncharacteristically hesitant. I've been invited to lead a research expedition to study abandoned mining sites in the Andes, she said without preamble. The environmental impact is significant, affecting indigenous communities and unique ecosystems. I need a strong team, including someone with your specific expertise in groundwater contamination assessment. I waited, sensing there was more. Some of the sites are remote, accessible only through narrow passages in the mountains. Given your history, I wanted to discuss this with you privately before offering you a position on the team. The old fear flickered briefly. Dark spaces, confined passages, the memory of rock dust filling my lungs. But alongside it came something stronger. Curiosity, purpose. The knowledge that my experience gave me unique insight into both the geological and human dimensions of such places. When do we leave? I asked. Dr. Shimizu's surprise was evident, quickly replaced by approval. March. The team will spend 6 weeks in the field. It's challenging work, both physically and emotionally. I'm ready, I said, and knew it was true. What happened to me in that mine? It's part of who I am now, but it doesn't limit where I can go or what I can do. If anything, it's become a source of strength. As I left her office, I realized the truth of my words. The mine had changed me, as trauma always changes those who experience it. But change is neutral, its meaning determined by what we build from it. Jack had intended the mine to be my ending. Instead, it had become my beginning, the point from which I measured my capacity for survival, for growth, for transformation. That evening, I called Sarah Thornton, our conversations having become a semi-regular occurrence since the trial. I've been invited to join a research expedition to South America, I told her, studying abandoned mines in the Andes. Her breath caught audibly. And you're going? I am. It's important work, and I'm uniquely qualified for it, partly because of what happened, not despite it. That's remarkable, she said after a moment. Most people would run in the opposite direction. I did that for a while, I admitted. But eventually you have to choose whether to be defined by what happened to you or by what you do about it. As we talked, I moved around my apartment, now truly mine in a way it hadn't been before. Photographs on the walls, books overflowing shelves, small treasures collected during fieldwork displayed on windowsills. No longer a hiding place but a home, built deliberately by a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she had survived. Outside, the Seattle night was clear for once, stars visible between buildings, the distant shape of mountains dark against the horizon. I thought about the journey ahead, not just the expedition to the Andes, but the longer path of continuing to build a life without fear as its foundation. Jack had tried to make the mine my grave. Instead, it had become the crucible that revealed what I was made of, not just flesh and bone and fear, but courage and intelligence and an unbreakable will to live. He had tried to write my ending, never imagining that I would emerge from the darkness to write my own story, one where the mine was just a single chapter, not the conclusion. In the end, what Jack failed to understand was that some things cannot be buried. Not truth, not justice, and certainly not the human spirit's capacity to transform darkness into light, trauma into strength, endings into beginnings. The Andes rise from the earth like a spine, ancient and uncompromising. Standing at our first research site, surrounded by mountains that make Colorado's Rockies seem gentle by comparison, I felt a strange sense of homecoming. Not because the terrain was familiar, these peaks were sharper, more dramatic than anything I'd known before, but because I recognized the feeling of being humbled by geological forces beyond human control. Our team of 8 researchers had arrived in Chile 3 days earlier, spending our first 48 hours in Santiago, gathering supplies and finalizing permits before heading into the mountains. Dr. Shimizu led the expedition with characteristic precision, each day's objectives clearly outlined, each team member's responsibilities defined. My role focused on groundwater assessment, testing samples from streams and springs near abandoned mining operations for heavy metal contamination and other toxins. The work was demanding but deeply satisfying. Each day began before dawn, packing equipment and hiking to designated sites, often through challenging terrain. We documented everything meticulously: water samples, soil conditions, local plant life showing signs of contamination. Evenings were spent in our temporary field lab, analyzing preliminary results and planning the next day's investigations. These levels of arsenic are concerning, I noted on our 4th day, examining water samples collected from a stream below an abandoned copper mine. The contamination extends at least 3 kilometers from the site, much farther than the mining company's environmental impact statement claimed. Dr. Shimizu nodded, her expression grave. The local community uses this water for irrigation. Their crops are likely contaminated as well. This was the pattern we found repeatedly: abandoned mines leaching toxins into water sources, affecting ecosystems and human communities long after operations ceased. It was exactly the kind of environmental crime Jack and Everglade Holdings had facilitated with their falsified reports and bribed officials. The work felt personal in a way that transcended my own history. I wasn't just studying contamination, I was documenting injustice. 10 days into our expedition, we reached a site high in the mountains, accessible only through a series of narrow canyons. The abandoned silver mine had been operational until the 1970s, then abruptly closed when the primary vein was exhausted. No remediation had been attempted. Equipment was simply abandoned, tunnels left unsealed, waste rock piled haphazardly. "We need to assess the main shaft," Dr. Shimizu said during our morning briefing. "According to satellite imagery and local reports, there's likely a significant pool of contaminated water in the lower levels. Seasonal rainfall may be causing periodic discharge into the watershed below." I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the physiological response to enclosed spaces that had become my unwanted companion. But alongside it came determination. This was why I had come, not just to gather data, but to face the very thing that had nearly killed me, now transformed into a tool for protecting others. "I'll take point on the main shaft assessment," I volunteered, meeting Dr. Shimizu's gaze steadily. "My experience with similar structures will be useful." She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Ryan will accompany you. The rest of the team will map surface features and collect external samples." Ryan Chen, the hydrologist I'd worked with in Washington, gave me a questioning look as we gathered our equipment. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. "No one would think less of you for sitting this one out." "I'm sure," I replied, checking my helmet light and backup flashlight. Some fears you conquer by facing them repeatedly until they lose their power. The entrance to the mine was partially collapsed, requiring careful navigation of fallen timbers and loose rock. As we moved deeper, the air grew cooler, heavy with mineral scents and the distinctive mustiness of long-abandoned human activity. Our lights illuminated rusted equipment, discarded tools, boot prints preserved in dried mud, ghosts of the men who had once extracted silver from these mountains without thought for the consequences. Unlike the mine where Jack had left me, this one had been a commercial operation with wider tunnels, more substantial support structures, and multiple levels connected by narrow shafts. We moved carefully, testing air quality and structural stability as we descended. Ryan maintained a professional demeanor, but I caught him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking, alert for signs of distress. "I'm okay," I assured him as we paused to document a particularly concerning crack in a support beam. This is different. Different how? He asked, genuinely curious. I considered the question as we continued downward. When I was trapped, I was alone, unprepared, betrayed by someone I trusted. Now I'm here by choice, with proper equipment, with someone who has my back. The physical space might trigger memories, but the context is completely transformed. He nodded, accepting my assessment. Sometimes the only way past fear is through it. Exactly. And there's purpose in this fear. We're documenting damage that's affecting real people, gathering evidence that could force accountability. We reached the lowest accessible level 300 feet below the surface. As predicted, a significant pool of water had collected where the main shaft intersected with the water table. The liquid gleamed an unnatural bluish-green in our lights, a visual indication of dissolved copper and other metals. This is worse than we anticipated, Ryan said, collecting samples with gloved hands. These concentration levels. If this is leaching into the watershed below, it could explain the elevated cancer rates in the valley communities. I nodded, photographing the pool and surrounding structures, noting the clear path where seasonal flooding would carry contaminated water through fissures in the rock, and completely preventable with proper mine closure procedures. The company saved money by walking away, and generations of local people are paying the price. As we worked, something unexpected happened. Instead of triggering panic, the enclosed space of the mine sharpened my focus, heightened my awareness of details that might have escaped notice. I found myself identifying structural weaknesses, potential flow paths, evidence of previous water level fluctuations, all valuable data for our assessment. You have an eye for this, Ryan remarked as I pointed out a subtle mineral deposit indicating periodic flooding. Most people wouldn't notice that pattern. When your life depends on observing your surroundings, you develop certain skills, I replied. In the mine where Jack left me, finding the ventilation shaft meant the difference between life and death. I had to see what wasn't immediately obvious. We spent 3 hours documenting conditions in the lower levels before beginning our ascent. As we climbed, I realized I felt none of the claustrophobic dread that had haunted me for the past 2 years. In its place was something closer to professional assessment, respect for the inherent dangers of underground spaces without paralyzing fear. Back at our base camp, as we organized samples and downloaded documentation, Dr. Shimizu pulled me aside. That couldn't have been easy, she said simply. It was easier than I expected, I admitted. I was so focused on the work, on what we were finding and what it meant, that there wasn't much room for fear. She nodded, unsurprised. Purpose is a powerful antidote to trauma. When we act in service of something larger than ourselves, our personal demons lose some of their potency. The remainder of the expedition followed a similar pattern, challenging sites, disturbing findings, communities affected by corporate negligence. At each location, I found myself moving more confidently through underground spaces, my technical skills enhanced rather than hindered by my past experiences. What Jack had intended as my destruction had instead become a source of unique insight. Our final site was the most remote, a gold mine abandoned in the 1980s, nestled high in a valley accessible only by helicopter. The surrounding landscape was breathtaking. Snow-capped peaks, alpine meadows, crystal-clear streams that belied the toxins lurking beneath the surface. The local indigenous community had been reporting mysterious illnesses for decades, their concerns dismissed by government officials who cited lack of evidence for any connection to the mine. We established our temporary field lab in a stone shelter once used by shepherds, now offered to us by community elders, eager for scientific validation of what they already knew. Each morning, community members would appear with additional information, places where livestock had died after drinking from certain streams, children who had developed rashes after swimming in once pristine pools, elders who remembered when fish had been abundant in waters now devoid of life. On our third day at the site, a woman named Elena approached me as I collected samples from a spring near the mine entrance. She was perhaps 60, her face weathered by mountain sun and wind, her eyes sharp with intelligence. "You understand these mountains differently than the others," she said in Spanish, watching me work. You listen to what they are trying to tell you. I smiled, surprised by her perception. I've learned that mountains keep secrets, but they also reveal them if you pay attention. She nodded, satisfied with my answer. The mine has poisoned our water for generations. The company men said it was safe, that we were imagining our sicknesses. They said we were trying to get money from them with lies. We're finding evidence that supports what you've been saying, I told her, indicating my collection of carefully labeled samples. These will be analyzed in laboratories with equipment that can detect even tiny amounts of contamination. And then what? She asked, her tone not accusatory but genuinely curious. More papers written? More reports filed? The poison remains, and my grandchildren still cannot swim in the streams where I once played. Her question cut to the heart of something I'd been wrestling with throughout the expedition. What was the purpose of our work, if not to create change? Data collection alone wouldn't clean contaminated water or heal sickened communities. The evidence we gather can be used to hold companies accountable, I explained. To force them to clean up the damage they've caused, to compensate affected communities. You speak from experience, Elena observed, her gaze disconcertingly perceptive. You have fought such battles before. I hesitated, then decided on honesty. Yes. I was involved in a case against a company that falsified environmental reports for mines in my country. They were eventually held accountable, but only after causing significant harm. She considered this, then reached into her pocket and withdrew a small object, a piece of quartz crystal embedded with threads of gold, polished smooth by water. My grandfather found this in the stream before the mine came, she said, placing it in my palm. He said the mountain gives gifts to those who treat her with respect. You respect the mountain's truth. Perhaps this will help you continue your fight. The gesture moved me deeply. I tried to refuse. The piece was clearly a family treasure, but Elena insisted. It has been waiting for the right hands, she said simply. Now it has found them. That night, examining the crystal by lamplight in our field shelter, I reflected on how far I had come from the desperate woman climbing through darkness in a Colorado mine. The journey hadn't been linear. Recovery never is. But each step, each challenge faced, each fear confronted, had built something new within me. Our expedition concluded 2 weeks later. We returned to Santiago with hundreds of samples, thousands of photographs, and comprehensive documentation of environmental violations that had gone unaddressed for decades. The university team would spend months analyzing the data, preparing reports, submitting findings to international environmental organizations and regulatory agencies. But I couldn't stop thinking about Elena's question. And then what? On our last night in Chile, as the team celebrated the successful completion of our work at a restaurant in Santiago, I found myself sharing these thoughts with Ryan. All this data, all this evidence, it matters only if it leads to action, I said, turning my wine glass slowly. These communities have been fighting for recognition of their suffering for generations. They need more than another scientific paper confirming what they already know. Ryan nodded, understanding immediately. You're thinking about what comes next. I am. The legal case against Everglade was important, but it was reactive, addressing harm already done. What if there's a way to be proactive? To prevent mines from being abandoned without proper closure, to hold companies accountable before generations of damage occurs. Sounds like you're describing a career shift, he observed. From pure research to advocacy. The idea crystallized as he spoke it aloud. Not abandoning my scientific work, but expanding its purpose. Using my technical expertise alongside my personal experience to bridge the gap between data collection and tangible change. Back in Seattle, I discussed these thoughts with Dr. Shimizu during our post-expedition debriefing. I want to focus my dissertation on developing protocols for community-based monitoring of abandoned mine sites, I explained. Systems that give affected communities tools to document contamination themselves, to generate evidence that can't be dismissed by corporate or government interests. She nodded thoughtfully. Combining scientific rigor with community empowerment. It's ambitious, but potentially transformative. The communities we visited, they know their lands intimately. They've observed changes over generations. But their knowledge is dismissed as anecdotal because it doesn't come wrapped in scientific methodology. And you want to change that equation, she said, a statement rather than a question. I do. What happened to me in that mine, it gave me a perspective I couldn't have gained any other way. I understand both the technical aspects of mining impacts and the human cost of corporate negligence. There's purpose in that combination. Dr. Shimizu studied me for a long moment, then smiled. I had a feeling the Andes would be transformative for you, though not quite in this way. Your dissertation committee will have questions about methodology and scope, but I support this direction. It's precisely the kind of innovative thinking environmental geology needs. Over the next year, my work evolved in ways I couldn't have imagined before the expedition. I developed a dissertation proposal combining rigorous scientific protocols with accessible methodologies that could be implemented by community members without specialized training. I designed simple, low-cost water testing kits that could provide preliminary evidence of contamination, triggering more comprehensive investigation. The work led to unexpected opportunities. I was invited to present at conferences, to consult with environmental justice organizations, to testify before a congressional committee examining reforms to mining regulations. My personal story became a powerful tool in these contexts, not as a victim narrative, but as evidence of the real-world consequences of regulatory failure and corporate malfeasance. Sarah Thornton, who had become a true friend despite our complicated connection, called after watching my congressional testimony online. You were magnificent, she said, her voice warm with pride. The way you transformed what Jack did to you into a call for systemic change. It's the ultimate redemption. Not redemption, I corrected gently. Reclamation. Like the process of healing damaged land, making it viable again after extraction has taken place. Reclamation, she repeated thoughtfully. I like that. It acknowledges the damage without being defined by it. On the second anniversary of my escape from the mine, I received an email from Detective Reyes with an unexpected update. The FBI investigation sparked by Jack's crimes had expanded beyond Everglade Holdings, uncovering a network of consulting firms providing falsified environmental assessments to mining operations across multiple states. The resulting prosecutions had led to significant regulatory reforms and a fund for remediation of abandoned mine sites. Thought you'd want to know that your courage continues to create ripples, Reyes wrote. What began with one woman refusing to stay buried has grown into systematic change. Not many victims can say their personal tragedy helped protect thousands of others. I sat with her words for a long time, feeling their weight and truth. When Jack sealed that tunnel, he believed he was writing my ending. He couldn't have imagined that instead, he was catalyzing a beginning, not just my personal recovery, but a chain of events that would lead to tangible environmental protections. 3 years after the mine, I successfully defended my dissertation on community-based monitoring protocols for abandoned mine sites. The work combined laboratory analysis with field testing in communities across the American West and South America, demonstrating that local knowledge paired with accessible scientific tools could identify contamination patterns often missed by conventional assessment methods. The day after my defense, I sat with Diane Wilcox on the deck of her mountain cabin, the place that had sheltered me in my darkest days. The sun was setting over the Colorado peaks, painting them gold and crimson. I remember you sitting in this exact spot when we first heard Jack's remains had been identified, Diane said, her academic reserve softened by memory. You were so still, processing what it meant to know he could never hurt you again. I nodded, remembering that moment of complicated relief. I thought his death would be the end of the story. I couldn't see then how much was still to come. Most people wouldn't have done what you've done with this experience, she observed. They would have tried to forget, to move on, to distance themselves from anything reminiscent of the trauma. I considered that path, I admitted, but it would have meant surrendering parts of myself. I wasn't willing to give up. My passion for geology, my belief in environmental justice, my capacity to find meaning in difficult experiences. You know, Diane said after a thoughtful pause, in geology we talk about pressure creating diamonds, heat transforming rock, catastrophic events reshaping landscapes. We rarely apply these concepts to human experience, but perhaps we should. The metaphor resonated deeply. Jack had intended the pressure of that collapsed tunnel to crush me. Instead, it had revealed qualities within myself I might never have discovered otherwise. Resilience, courage, the capacity to transform trauma into purpose. 2 weeks after completing my PhD, I accepted a joint position with the Environmental Protection Agency and the University of Washington, dividing my time between teaching environmental geology and implementing the community monitoring protocols I'd developed. The work took me to abandoned mine sites across the country, to communities struggling with contamination, to corporate boardrooms and government hearings. At each site, I carried Elena's crystal, a tangible reminder that the mountains hold both poisons and gifts, and that respect for truth, however painful, is the beginning of healing. I also carried the knowledge that my greatest strength had emerged from my darkest moment, that the tunnel meant to be my grave had instead become the passage to a life of unexpected purpose. On a crisp autumn day, 5 years after the mine, I stood at the entrance to a newly remediated site in Montana, a former gold mine now transformed through comprehensive environmental restoration. The contaminated ponds had been drained and treated, waste rock properly contained, native vegetation replanted. Most importantly, the local watershed showed decreasing levels of heavy metals, the beginning of ecological recovery. The remediation had been one of the first projects implemented under the new regulations prompted by the Everglade case. My testimony, my experience, my subsequent research had contributed directly to the policies requiring this restoration. What had once been a source of community illness was being transformed into land that could heal. As I documented the changes, comparing current conditions to baseline measurements from years earlier, I thought about the long arc that had brought me here, from a terrified woman facing betrayal and death to a scientist whose work helped prevent others from suffering similar harm. The journey hadn't erased the trauma, nothing could do that completely, but it had woven that experience into a larger tapestry of meaning and purpose. Jack had seen me as expendable, a problem to be buried and forgotten. He couldn't have imagined that in trying to silence me, he would instead give me a voice that carried further than I could have achieved otherwise. He couldn't have known that the darkness he condemned me to would ultimately illuminate a path that would help countless others. That night, I stood under a vast Montana sky filled with stars, feeling the solid earth beneath my feet, the mountains rising dark against the horizon. I thought about all the women who had been underestimated, all those who had been told their voices didn't matter, all who had faced betrayal from those they trusted. I thought about how survival itself can be an act of revolution, how refusing to stay buried, literally or figuratively, changes not just an individual life, but ripples outward to affect many others. I thought about how trauma, terrible as it is, can sometimes be the crucible in which purpose is forged. The truth is, none of us choose our darkest moments. We don't select the trials that will test us beyond what we believe we can endure. But we do choose what we build from those experiences, whether we allow them to define us permanently or use them as foundation stones for something new and unexpectedly beautiful. Jack thought he knew exactly who I was, someone who could be manipulated, controlled, and ultimately disposed of when I became inconvenient. What he failed to understand was that people, like the earth itself, contain depths and resources invisible from the surface. He saw me as a simple problem to eliminate. He never imagined I would emerge from that darkness transformed, not into a victim seeking vengeance, but into a force for change he could never have anticipated. In the end, the mine became not my tomb, but my metamorphosis, the place where pressure and darkness didn't destroy me, but revealed what I was truly made of. And that revelation continues to light my way forward, illuminating not just my path, but the paths of others seeking justice, healing, and transformation in the aftermath of their own darkest moments. Because that's the thing about trying to bury someone alive. Sometimes they don't just survive. Sometimes they emerge with exactly the tools, the perspective, and the purpose needed to change the world you thought you controlled. Sometimes what you intend as an ending becomes instead a powerful, unexpected beginning. The Andes rise from the earth like a spine, ancient and uncompromising. Standing at our first research site, surrounded by mountains that make Colorado's Rockies seem gentle by comparison, I felt a strange sense of homecoming. Not because the terrain was familiar, these peaks were sharper, more dramatic than anything I'd known before, but because I recognized the feeling of being humbled by geological forces beyond human control. Our team of 8 researchers had arrived in Chile 3 days earlier, spending our first 48 hours in Santiago, gathering supplies and finalizing permits before heading into the mountains. Dr. Shimizu led the expedition with characteristic precision, each day's objectives clearly outlined, each team member's responsibilities defined. My role focused on groundwater assessment, testing samples from streams and springs near abandoned mining operations for heavy metal contamination and other toxins. The work was demanding but deeply satisfying. Each day began before dawn, packing equipment and hiking to designated sites, often through challenging terrain. We documented everything meticulously: water samples, soil conditions, local plant life showing signs of contamination. Evenings were spent in our temporary field lab, analyzing preliminary results and planning the next day's investigations. These levels of arsenic are concerning, I noted on our 4th day, examining water samples collected from a stream below an abandoned copper mine. The contamination extends at least 3 kilometers from the site, much farther than the mining company's environmental impact statement claimed. Dr. Shimizu nodded, her expression grave. The local community uses this water for irrigation. Their crops are likely contaminated as well. This was the pattern we found repeatedly: abandoned mines leaching toxins into water sources, affecting ecosystems and human communities long after operations ceased. It was exactly the kind of environmental crime Jack and Everglade Holdings had facilitated with their falsified reports and bribed officials. The work felt personal in a way that transcended my own history. I wasn't just studying contamination, I was documenting injustice. 10 days into our expedition, we reached a site high in the mountains, accessible only through a series of narrow canyons. The abandoned silver mine had been operational until the 1970s, then abruptly closed when the primary vein was exhausted. No remediation had been attempted. Equipment was simply abandoned, tunnels left unsealed, waste rock piled haphazardly. "We need to assess the main shaft," Dr. Shimizu said during our morning briefing. "According to satellite imagery and local reports, there's likely a significant pool of contaminated water in the lower levels. Seasonal rainfall may be causing periodic discharge into the watershed below." I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the physiological response to enclosed spaces that had become my unwanted companion. But alongside it came determination. This was why I had come, not just to gather data, but to face the very thing that had nearly killed me, now transformed into a tool for protecting others. "I'll take point on the main shaft assessment," I volunteered, meeting Dr. Shimizu's gaze steadily. "My experience with similar structures will be useful." She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Ryan will accompany you. The rest of the team will map surface features and collect external samples." Ryan Chen, the hydrologist I'd worked with in Washington, gave me a questioning look as we gathered our equipment. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. "No one would think less of you for sitting this one out." "I'm sure," I replied, checking my helmet light and backup flashlight. "Some fears you conquer by facing them repeatedly until they lose their power." The entrance to the mine was partially collapsed, requiring careful navigation of fallen timbers and loose rock. As we moved deeper, the air grew cooler, heavy with mineral scents and the distinctive mustiness of long-abandoned human activity. Our lights illuminated rusted equipment, discarded tools, boot prints preserved in dried mud, ghosts of the men who had once extracted silver from these mountains without thought for the consequences. Unlike the mine where Jack had left me, this one had been a commercial operation with wider tunnels, more substantial support structures, and multiple levels connected by narrow shafts. We moved carefully, testing air quality and structural stability as we descended. Ryan maintained a professional demeanor, but I caught him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking, alert for signs of distress. "I'm okay," I assured him as we paused to document a particularly concerning crack in a support beam. "This is different." "Different how?" he asked, genuinely curious. I considered the question as we continued downward. When I was trapped, I was alone, unprepared, betrayed by someone I trusted. Now I'm here by choice, with proper equipment, with someone who has my back. The physical space might trigger memories, but the context is completely transformed. He nodded, accepting my assessment. Sometimes the only way past fear is through it. Exactly. And there's purpose in this fear. We're documenting damage that's affecting real people, gathering evidence that could force accountability. We reached the lowest accessible level 300 feet below the surface. As predicted, a significant pool of water had collected where the main shaft intersected with the water table. The liquid gleamed an unnatural bluish-green in our lights, a visual indication of dissolved copper and other metals. This is worse than we anticipated, Ryan said, collecting samples with gloved hands. These concentration levels. If this is leaching into the watershed below, it could explain the elevated cancer rates in the valley communities. I nodded, photographing the pool and surrounding structures, noting the clear path where seasonal flooding would carry contaminated water through fissures in the rock, and completely preventable with proper mine closure procedures. The company saved money by walking away, and generations of local people are paying the price. As we worked, something unexpected happened. Instead of triggering panic, the enclosed space of the mine sharpened my focus, heightened my awareness of details that might have escaped notice. I found myself identifying structural weaknesses, potential flow paths, evidence of previous water level fluctuations, all valuable data for our assessment. You have an eye for this, Ryan remarked as I pointed out a subtle mineral deposit indicating periodic flooding. Most people wouldn't notice that pattern. When your life depends on observing your surroundings, you develop certain skills, I replied. In the mine where Jack left me, finding the ventilation shaft meant the difference between life and death. I had to see what wasn't immediately obvious. We spent 3 hours documenting conditions in the lower levels before beginning our ascent. As we climbed, I realized I felt none of the claustrophobic dread that had haunted me for the past 2 years. In its place was something closer to professional assessment. Respect for the inherent dangers of underground spaces without paralyzing fear. Back at our base camp, as we organized samples and downloaded documentation, Dr. Shimizu pulled me aside. That couldn't have been easy, she said simply. It was easier than I expected, I admitted. I was so focused on the work, on what we were finding and what it meant, that there wasn't much room for fear. She nodded, unsurprised. Purpose is a powerful antidote to trauma. When we act in service of something larger than ourselves, our personal demons lose some of their potency. The remainder of the expedition followed a similar pattern. Challenging sites, disturbing findings, communities affected by corporate negligence. At each location, I found myself moving more confidently through underground spaces, my technical skills enhanced rather than hindered by my past experiences. What Jack had intended as my destruction had instead become a source of unique insight. Our final site was the most remote, a gold mine abandoned in the 1980s, nestled high in a valley accessible only by helicopter. The surrounding landscape was breathtaking, snow-capped peaks, alpine meadows, crystal-clear streams that belied the toxins lurking beneath the surface. The local indigenous community had been reporting mysterious illnesses for decades, their concerns dismissed by government officials who cited lack of evidence for any connection to the mine. We established our temporary field lab in a stone shelter once used by shepherds, now offered to us by community elders, eager for scientific validation of what they already knew. Each morning, community members would appear with additional information, places where livestock had died after drinking from certain streams, children who had developed rashes after swimming in once pristine pools, elders who remembered when fish had been abundant in waters now devoid of life. On our third day at the site, a woman named Elena approached me as I collected samples from a spring near the mine entrance. She was perhaps 60, her face weathered by mountain sun and wind, her eyes sharp with intelligence. "You understand these mountains differently than the others," she said in Spanish, watching me work. "You listen to what they are trying to tell you." I smiled, surprised by her perception. I've learned that mountains keep secrets, but they also reveal them if you pay attention. She nodded, satisfied with my answer. The mine has poisoned our water for generations. The company men said it was safe, that we were imagining our sicknesses. They said we were trying to get money from them with lies. We're finding evidence that supports what you've been saying, I told her, indicating my collection of carefully labeled samples. These will be analyzed in laboratories with equipment that can detect even tiny amounts of contamination. And then what? She asked, her tone not accusatory but genuinely curious. More papers written? More reports filed? The poison remains, and my grandchildren still cannot swim in the streams where I once played. Her question cut to the heart of something I'd been wrestling with throughout the expedition. What was the purpose of our work if not to create change? Data collection alone wouldn't clean contaminated water or heal sickened communities. The evidence we gather can be used to hold companies accountable, I explained. To force them to clean up the damage they've caused, to compensate affected communities. You speak from experience, Elena observed, her gaze disconcertingly perceptive. You have fought such battles before. I hesitated, then decided on honesty. Yes, I was involved in a case against a company that falsified environmental reports for mines in my country. They were eventually held accountable, but only after causing significant harm. She considered this, then reached into her pocket and withdrew a small object. A piece of quartz crystal embedded with threads of gold, polished smooth by water. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.